I'm Jim Forsyth. San Antonio is a fast-growing, fast-moving community with something new happening almost every day. That's why each week I go on the record with one of the newsmakers who is driving this change and this growth. And then join us for the conversation, a lively discussion with the reporters and community leaders about the issues that matter. So join us now as we go on the record.
And now, Jim Forsyth.
Hello and welcome again to On the Record, a weekly unrehearsed discussion of the key issues and challenges which face us today here in San Antonio and South Texas. I'm Jim Forsyth, and I'd like to welcome as our guest on the Record, Doug Melnick. He is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of San Antonio. Doug, thank you very much for joining us for On the Record.
Thank you for having me.
And it's been a busy week for you. Obviously, the federal government's latest report on climate change was dropped on Black Friday, not out of coincidence, I'm sure. What are some of the bullet points? What are some of the takeaways that made you raise your eyebrows when you read this latest report?
Sure. So this report is a ongoing report that is mandated by Congress, that it's prepared by these federal agencies. Basically, it reaffirms everything that we have seen over the years about the climate issue, that our climate is changing. It is having dire impacts now on our communities, and it's projected to get worse. And so I think it's another call to action for this country as well as our own community here in San Antonio. How are we going to face this head on? Because if we don't take action now, we will not be able to mitigate those worst impacts that are projected.
And what do you anticipate those worst impacts to be, especially for us here in a climate which is already warm?
Sure. So we're currently developing a climate action and adaptation plan that was authorized by City Council last year, called SA Climate Ready. And as a part of that process, we undertook a climate projection study working with UTSA, and it's very consistent with the findings of this National Climate Assessment. We're looking at increased heat. By 2100, we're expecting upwards of 100 more days over 100-degree temperature. We can start expecting days of 110 degrees. It's going to be really hot a lot of time of the year. We can expect to see increased reduction in precipitation, so increased drought and drought severity. But when it does rain or we do have storm events, they're going to be more extreme. So we'll see an increase in the number of 100 and 500-year flood events. With that comes a decrease in air quality, increase in vector-borne diseases and other public health issues, impact on our infrastructure, and impacts on our energy rates, simply because we'll be running our air conditioners more often. And I think the real big takeaway is it's going to impact our most vulnerable populations the most, the people who can least adapt, low-income populations, seniors, those with pre-existing health conditions, the very young. These are the folks that are going to experience the impacts the most.
Now, here in San Antonio, you've been working on this for some time. As you read this report, what are the sections that stood out to you as being things that will really affect South Texas and things that we need to deal with as a community?
Right. So I think, Texas is one of those states that's been identified along with Florida at being the most at risk. We've already experienced major impacts. The Gulf Coast gets hurricanes on a regular basis. While they may not hit San Antonio directly, we get those climate refugees. We need to house them. We need to care for them. We need to provide those resources. We need to send resources down to the coast to help support the rebuilding. And those residents may not leave. So how do we care for them? When we look at those energy costs, we are a community that's fortunate enough to have a municipally owned utility that supplies energy not just to San Antonio, but to ERCOT. So how do we balance those long-term goals of decarbonizing our grid and our energy supply with cost impacts? And then, as I mentioned before, it's flooding is a major issue. Every year it seems as though we experience those major flood events that particularly impact our certain areas of the city. Those are going to get worse. And how do we start adapting our residents, our businesses, our growth to those future impacts.
Now, reference, we just had a significant flood event, a deadly one, just north of here in Austin. Is that the kind of thing that you're looking for being more frequent and more severe because of climate change?
Absolutely, and that's sort of where local governments are now. And one of the things that we've known for quite some time now is in absence of federal leadership on this, local governments across the country, mayors, city councils have stepped up and said, this is something that we need to tackle. And so where we are now, along with cities across the country, is looking at what our climate vulnerabilities are, looking at what those projections are, and doing an assessment of our infrastructure. And Austin, they've been working on this for years, were probably taken by surprise that their potent water supply was vulnerable to this increased flooding. Those are the sort of conversations that we need to have locally to ensure that our basic services can continue and adapt to these increased risks.
Now, you mentioned the very young. Now, the very young are the only people who are listening to this broadcast who are still going to be around in 2100. Why should we care in 2018, 2019? And what do you say to those who say, yes, but technology will come along and help us rectify those problems, just like technology came along and rectified the problems that people dealt with in the latter 19th century. Disease has been dealt with through vaccination. We have air conditioning. We have a power grid that we didn't have then. What do you say to people who say, yes, but in 80 years, technology will have risen to the point that it can ameliorate all of these issues?
Right, and so in terms of why is it important now? I think this isn't a long-term challenge anymore. As I mentioned, we're experiencing the impacts now. So this is something that affects every citizen of this country, whether it's directly or indirectly. It impacts our economy, it impacts supply chains. It's something that we are experiencing now. In terms of why we need to really take action now, and what do we say to folks? Technology does play a key component to this, but we can't just rely on technology. We still need to take actions now. Climate science has shown us that while we need to look towards where our greenhouse gas emission reductions need to be in 2050, there's a steep curve that needs to occur now. We cannot simply do a gradual reduction. Climate science is saying the next 5 to 7 years are key, where we need to make the most drastic reductions. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to mitigate the most extreme impacts. When we talk to people who don't necessarily believe this, one, it's about translating it into what's important to them. It's talking about people's families, their communities, their health and well-being. It's, if we're talking to the business community, it's talking about things that they're already doing. They already have probably an emergency preparedness plan. They're probably already looking at what do they do if there's supply chain disruption due to a major flood event. I think the key is getting people to understand that these impacts are only going to become more severe. And if we don't take action now, those costs, both in human life and in economic costs, are going to be more severe in the future.
Now, here in Texas, we have unique challenges in adapting to the changing world that's brought about by climate change. And that's the fact that the oil and gas industry, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, has become a major economic generator, not only in this part of the state, but across the state. How do you go to people whose lives and well-being, whether they work in the industry themselves or they work in a spin-off industry, how can we, over the coming years, go to these people and say, you know something? The industry which has enabled you to live the lifestyle you have, the income that you enjoy, that you would probably not be able to make in any other industry, has to be reduced, and that could mean you lose your job. How do we make that argument?
Right, and that's key, and that's a big challenge. I think the big picture is we need, and it's already occurring, is a major transformation of the energy sector. We are seeing jobs in the renewable energy sector far outpace from traditional oil and gas. I think we need to work with state and federal governments. We need to work with the major energy corporations to develop that roadmap towards that cleaner, carbon-free future. and make sure that we are adapting and providing job opportunities for anyone who's working in oil and gas. I think the opportunity is there, the resources are there. My belief is that it's just going to take a very pragmatic and direct approach to make sure that we aren't leaving anybody behind. Oil and gas provided a foundation for the state and this country, but I think what we're seeing from the environmental impacts, what we are seeing from the idea of building a more resilient energy sector, and seeing the cost benefit of renewable technology, that's the way we need to go. I think it's just making sure that we have that plan in place to expedite it and make sure that all those existing workers benefit from that transition.
One thing that really struck me, especially having grown up in a small town in the Midwest, was the impact that climate change is going to have on agriculture, especially in the small towns and rural areas around here. We rely on our, most of us realize our food doesn't come from H-E-B, it comes from farms and ranches. What unique impacts will rural areas face because of climate change, in your opinion?
Right, and I think there is a chapter in the National Climate Assessment that starts talking about rural areas and agricultural areas. They're going to experience the same impacts. They're going to experience extreme heat, potentially increased drought versus extreme flooding events. But may not have the resources to adapt. That's one of the challenges I think that a lot of small towns have is not having that capacity, whether it's economic or in terms of professional support, to go through a planning process like the city of San Antonio is doing. So I think being able to identify those statewide or national resources that can be made available for small town America and key agricultural areas to ensure that they are evaluating those risks and preparing and adapting to them. Because again, if you don't have if you are busy just getting food on the table, providing food for your neighbors and for this country, you may not have time to really look at what those impacts are and adapt to it. But it definitely, when we start looking at food systems and the vulnerability nationally that we have to ensuring that those supply chains continue for our cities and our small towns, that's a big risk.
Let's wrap this up by assuming that during the time we've been talking here, it's become 2050. Let's assume that what you would like to see happen has happened. When we walk out of this studio onto Broadway, how will the San Antonio we see be different because of the changes we must make due to climate change? Will we see no gas stations? Will we see all electric vehicles? Will the buildings be designed differently?
Right, and that's you mentioned it a little earlier about relying on technology. Technology is going to play a key, and to make sure we can meet these really aggressive goals. But we would see hopefully a San Antonio and a streetscape where it has high visibility of renewable energy, that we see energy being produced from clean sources. We see an abundance of trees, green infrastructure, low impact development, which is designed to capture stormwater, reduce flooding, improve air quality, but also provide other health benefits. We see diverse transportation options. We need to move away from the gas-powered single occupancy vehicle, more transit, more bike infrastructure. Who knows what transportation is going to look like in the future, but at the end of the day, it needs to be a highly clean and efficient system that we're living in.
Doug Melnick is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of San Antonio. Thank you very much for your insights today on the Record.